It had to be one of the biggest revolutionary times, I think, in American music, and it certainly set the stage for what was going to be an explosion of new talents. Names that are so familiar to you, Bobby Vee, Buddy Holly, the Platters, the Shirelles. You know, it was just a phenomenal time for Americans and for new types of musicians to enter the center stage. And with me today is a person on Hudson Valley Views, Anthony Musso. Anthony, how are you doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
I really enjoy talking about this because I think Americans kind of really grew up, and from this wellspring of American talent that really was a combination of many different things, really set an international stage, didn't it?
It certainly did. I mean, this is really what you consider true American music. It just took, the kids wanted their own music. You know, they didn't want their parents' music of big bands and Tommy Dorsey and everything. And so when soul and R&B and blues and everything else merged into what became rockabilly and later rock and roll, they finally had their own voice.
It wasn't an easy trip, though, was it? I mean, rockabilly was considered kind of the outside kid.
That was the outside kid, and of course rock and roll, as we know, was called the devil's music.
Right.
It wasn't readily accepted, and as successful as the concerts were, they got a lot of bad press. You know, it was really looked and frowned upon by the older generation.
It really was, because it really didn't fit any of their frames at all. What would trigger something like this, do you think?
Well, I think that they were intimidated. The older generation was intimidated by a young Elvis Presley shaking around on the stage and making those gyrating moves.
Ed Sullivan Show?
Exactly, where they had to shoot him, by the way, only from the waist up. That was mandated. And, you know, you can't make that up.
Well, and the stories that you would hear about these guys, I mean, really having to, Buddy Holly, the Crickets, I mean, having to, when they performed up north, it was a real shock to many of the groups who were not used to that kind of music at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Buddy Holly and the Crickets were definitely one of the pioneers, and they brought that kind of rockabilly sound over into the rock and roll era.
And he was kind of a geeky-looking guy.
Wasn't he, with the big glasses? But you know, when he got on stage and he opened his mouth, he created a lot of excitement. And that's what the kids were looking for.
Well, you know, the excitement that's being stirred up by what you're doing now is of course, your book, and it's called Setting the Record Straight.
Right.
Volume 1 and Volume 2. And Setting the Record Straight is just it is a journey in time, but it really is setting the record straight on a lot of these names that were, everybody knew Dion, everybody wanted to be Connie Francis, and yet there's so many inaccuracies. And you're a journalist, columnist with Gannett. You've written books before. So what would set you on this journey? Well,
what motivated me to write it was, you know, you just alluded to, I wrote FDR in the post office, and I was doing a lot of lectures in support of that book. And at night, just to unwind, I started researching some of the biographies of my favorite groups, the groups I grew up with and danced to, the Drifters, the Platters, and the Coasters. And I was shocked kind of to find out that, you know, on the internet and various sources, you can get 8 or 10 different biographies. None of them agreed.
Wow.
There was so much conflicting information about how the groups came together, why the songs were written. And it just, the seed as an author went into the back of my head that this would really be a nice topic to straighten out these biographies, because as we know, they are icons in American pop culture.
Right.
Why shouldn't they have correct biographies?
Well, a lot of it was the music business itself, though, wasn't it?
It certainly was. You know, I won't say that the inaccuracies were done on purpose. They weren't done viciously. Right. You remember the old LPs that we all had in those days, the vinyl albums. On the back of the albums, they're what they call liner notes.
Right.
That told about the group and everything. Well, I found out rather quickly from a lot of the artists that the people that wrote those liner notes didn't know them from a hole in the wall, never met them.
They were just a PR agency.
They were PR, and their job was to sell them to the public, so they made facts up. Now, what compounded that is when Murray Decay and Wolfman Jack and all these DJs got on the air and introduced a new song, where do you think they got their information from? The liner notes.
Right.
And when you hear it on the radio, it must be fact.
Now, a lot of these guys actually were kind of not helping these groups at all either, were they really?
Well,
and by that I mean this, is that they were taking advantage of these young kids who were really neophytes in an old business of music.
You know, when you talk about people like the agents, the managers, the record company owners, yeah, there was a lot of taking advantage of kids that were basically, you know, when you think about groups like Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers and all those, they were 12, 13, 14 years old.
Right.
They didn't know what trademark meant, they didn't know what royalties meant, and they were really taking advantage.
And so when they were signing their names, sometimes they we're going to talk about, you know, well, one of them was Bo Diddley, who found himself without any money, even though he had numerous hits, and we'll talk about that.
Yes.
But let's go back to the Buddy Holly story. Very interesting. Now we're seeing he had that continual fear of flying, and yet this geeky-looking kid and the Crickets. What an interesting story, and he's one of those young men that you were talking about.
Right. Well, I chronicle him in the Bobby V chapter, because they were on the tour, that famous tour that we lost Buddy Holly and Richie Valens and the Big Bopper in a plane crash. The bus had no heat for days on end. Right. Which motivated a lot of the artists to get together and kind of pool their money and charter a flight. Unfortunately for the three that passed, they were the only three that went on, you know, and died in that tragic accident. Dion came very close to getting on that plane too, but he just didn't have the money to help fund it, so he took the bus to the next location. But where Bobby V comes into play is, you know, the show must go on.
Right.
And they decided that the next night, the concert had to go on, and a local radio station, the next stop, put out a call for local artists. Bobby V was in a band with his brothers called the Shadows, and he actually replaced Buddy Holly the next night on that show, and he said it was a very bittersweet experience because Buddy Holly, ironically, was his idol his entire life growing up.
How does Bobby V now, in terms of some of these stories? It must be something to have. These kids were having to constantly be on the road, having to constantly promote themselves. I mean, is it a lot different today in terms of the business?
Well, I'm sure it's a lot different in terms of limousines today.
Right.
But you know what? A lot of the groups, the Ronettes I spoke to Dave Somerville, the lead singer of the Diamonds, Little Darlin' fame.
Right.
They loved those bus tours. I mean, and they were grueling too, because they would do 70 cities in 70 nights, basically sleep on the bus, get into the city the next day. Nedra Talley, one of the original Ronettes, told me that she was lucky. She said, I was 16 years old and real skinny, and I used to sleep in the luggage rack while all the rest of them had to kind of just sitting up. But they seemed to enjoy it.
Yeah, boy, the way to see the world, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, one of those was Brenda Lee. I mean, little girl, big voice. Now you have a very interesting story about her and a midget, being a midget.
Yeah, Brenda Lee, they kept, you know, she had a very powerful voice, but she was a kid. She was 13 years old.
Wow.
And she was doing a tour of Europe, and the European promoter kept sending over messages to her manager to send photos of her. So he sent photos of Brenda Lee. And he would get a message back that said, no, we need more current photos, because they couldn't believe this little girl was this powerful voice. So as a joke, the manager sent over a notice that said, she's a 32-year-old midget. Well, when they landed in Paris that day, the major newspaper in Paris had that as the headline, 32-year-old American midget to sing tonight at the concert hall. And that could be another way how stories get out there.
Well, you know, it's finagling the press and trying to constantly gain in terms of the press. I mean, that had the upsides and downsides, didn't it? I mean, Paul and Paula, for example, if you take a look at the Paul and Paula story. Now, I think one of the things that made it interesting, because I remember seeing him on Dick Clark.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Dick Clark was a huge promoter of these guys.
American Bandstand, absolutely.
And now, how did Dick Clark figure in with these acts? How did he decide?
Well, I could tell you a funny story. What happened with Paul and Paula while they were on a Dick Clark Caravan of Stars tours. Those were those multi-month tours that you would just sit on a bus and go from city to city. And in the middle of the tour, Paul, whose real name is Ray Hildebrand, he was a devout Christian, and he was really getting kind of put off by a lot of the after-concert parties, who in his description to me, he said it was getting a little out of hand as they were going along. Right. And in the middle of the night, he couldn't take it anymore, and he slipped a note under Paula's door. Her real name is Jill Jackson. And he slipped a note under Dick Clark's door. He couldn't even have he said, I didn't even have the nerve to talk to them, but he walked away in the middle of the tour.
Because he couldn't take the party.
He couldn't take because he was very religious, and he said it was really getting over the top. Ironically, Dick Clark was initially going to cancel the act, obviously. Half the act had left, but they decided that because the song was so popular, their big hit, Hey Paul, right?
Hey Paula.
That Dick Clark actually sang his part for the rest of the tour, to keep it in tune. So if you could picture Dick Clark singing Paul's part, that must have been kind of funny.
It was interesting, though, because Dick Clark, the world's oldest teenager, really did have but he must have had some kind of a policy in terms of who could make it to the American Bandstand.
Well, there were stories about Dick Clark having business interests in Cameo Records and Swan Records and some of these, and those artists were definitely favored, let's say, for appearances on the American Bandstand show. Absolutely.
So he had but you also became engaged in kind of the personalities on American Bandstand. I think that's what really kind of everybody seemed to be a teenager.
The dances with celebrities.
And they had their you could tell who was going steady, who wasn't going steady. It became a whole kind of environment.
I can't tell you how many recording artists out of the 100 that I interviewed told me that when they did American Bandstand and met the dancers, they were in awe of them because they were the stars. And here these fellows were coming on to sing Coney Island Baby and all the songs we grew up, but they looked at the dancers as the true stars.
Oh boy, I remember the slide and the whole thing on the American Bandstand you had to watch.
Yeah.
It was another part of that, though, and that was, I think it was interesting watching how minority artists began to really become part of that picture.
Yes.
Chubby Checker was certainly one of those in the twist. And,
yes.
And so, I mean, that began a whole kind of new revolution in terms of, is this acceptable dancing? Is it not? But, Chubby had his own kind of, there was controversies around having a minority. Nice guy that he was.
Chubby is quite a character. His real name is Ernest Evans. And he used to sing, the way the story goes, in a poultry market. He was working in a poultry market in Philadelphia. That's why a lot of the acts on Bandstand came from Philadelphia. As Chubby and Bobby Rydell and Frankie Avalon, the Dovells, and on and on.
Wow.
And his boss knew Dick Clark and actually got Chubby to do a Christmas record called The Class. He does very good impersonations, Chubby.
Wow.
And they gave it to Dick Clark, and he loved it so much that they released the record. And actually, that was Chubby's first hit. A lot of people don't. And he got his name from Dick Clark's wife. She said, "Oh, Chubby." So it's Chubby Checker like Fats Domino. And that's how he got his name.
Well, it would stick with him, wouldn't it?
It certainly did.
Did he go on tour a lot, and how did they work
Still
that
does.
out? No kidding.
Still does. Chubby's got a big bus, and he's still, I heard he was in Waterbury, Connecticut last week signing CDs.
No kidding.
Yeah, Chubby's very active. I see him quite often.
Well, when you were getting into these stories, were there those that just absolutely astounded you at how hard it was for a lot of these people to make it in the business? Because it really was grueling. It was, for all of the stardom, it really was a grueling business for a lot of these
when
young
you're sitting
people.
on a bus for 3 months, and it's really tough. And they had not all the experience was good experiences on the road too, especially for some of the integrated groups and things of that nature.
Yeah, because it really was a time there was some tenseness in the nation, but there were some changes going on as well. So what about the different groups that had that issue? I mean,
well, there were integrated groups in those days, like the Crests with Johnny Maestro, who had 16 Candles. The Del Vikings were integrated. The Marcells, Blue Moon, were integrated. I interviewed Johnny Maestro and Cornelius Harp from the Marcells for the book. And it was pretty harrowing when they went down to the southern states and toured. Johnny Maestro, who of course they were riding on the hit 16 Candles, which was huge.
Right.
But when they went to certain venues in the South, either Johnny Maestro had to sing it solo, or the three minorities in the group had to sing it without their lead singer. So many times they just opted out of respect for each other not to sing. That group was an Italian-American, Johnny Maestro, 2 African-Americans, and 1 Puerto Rican. And certain venues just wouldn't have any part of them performing at the same time.
Was, it took a long time for Americans to, the same thing happened with Tom Dreesen and Tim Reed, the first black and white comedian team, and
Yes.
a lot of heckling, a lot of during the 50s, the 60s, a lot of sorting out for America.
Yeah. Well, one artist, if you remember the Tune Weavers, Happy, Happy Birthday Baby.
Oh, that's her do.
And John Sylvia told me it was very bizarre. They got to one venue in South Carolina where they literally had a stage facing a brick wall. And he said you had a black audience on one side
Right.
and a white audience on the other side, and you had to sing this romantic song to a brick wall, and you were prohibited from looking one way or the other, or they pull you right off the stage.
How
So
bizarre.
you really had to play to a brick wall. And he said, you think that was hard to do, singing a love song? It was pretty strange for them.
It took us a long while to get, through this
definitely
whole.
did.
I mean, it really was an interesting, and that's why I think it was so revolutionary, because
Yes.
it really was playing to various audiences. It was obviously a time of real significant change, for America. Did the music reflect that as well? Do you think? Was it? Were there messages in those songs?
Oh, absolutely. I'll bring one right up at the top of my head, Danny and the Juniors
Right.
at the Hop.
Uh-huh.
Well, they had a follow-up song to that, and what motivated that was they were doing a big show in Cleveland, Ohio, and Joe Terry, who I interviewed from Danny and the Juniors, he's an original member, said they came off the stage so high. It was the crowd was so much into the show and everything, and when they picked up the newspaper the next day, the headline said, "Rock and roll stinks out the city."
Whoa.
So they were very critical, the older generation, the foundation of the generations. And so when they came back to his house, they were sitting in the living room and kind of complaining about that. And Joe Terry's father motivated him to write the song, Rock and Roll is Here to Stay, which is basically viewed as the first protest song in rock and roll, because it was like, we're not going away.
Wow.
We're here and we're going to stay and we're going to keep playing this music.
That would become a constant theme later with Don McLean. A number of different artists would say, those were the days when music was real music.
Yeah, it was basic roots. It was basic roots, and a lot of that was because they drew from the blues.
Right.
They drew from all these grassroots musics and melded it into rock and roll.
It was an astounding thing, because these kids really had their own, had to really make it on their own. No, Connie Francis. I mean, what was her name really? You have it in the book.
I have it in the book, and I have to read it right out of the book. Her real name was Conchetta Rosa Maria Francanero, if you can imagine.
Connie Francis is good enough for me.
Arthur Godfrey actually gave her that name.
No kidding.
He said, that's a tongue twister, little girl, and I don't think I can remember it. And we're going to call you Connie Francis. And she said, oh, please, Mr. Godfrey, if you could just call me Connie Francanero tonight, my father will rest easy. And from the next day on, she became Connie Francis.
She had a very tough time, though, didn't she?
She had a very rough life, but an extremely nice person. She gave me such a wonderful interview and was very candid about it. She went through some trauma in her life. She got raped at Westbury Music Fair in the Howard Johnsons, and her brother was murdered, and she was very candid about all of that. Ironically, she credits her father. Well, we wouldn't know Connie Francis if it wasn't for her father. She was on her last recording contract, her last recording session, after putting 18 records out with no noise, didn't go anywhere. And she got down, and a song that her father kept prodding her to sing, and she said, Dad, I can't sing this in front of teenagers. They'll laugh me off the stage. And that song was Who's Sorry Now?
Oh, my
and
gosh.
She came
One of her
down,
top hits.
Her first.
Yeah.
And she came down to her last 8 minutes in her recording session, and she was trying not to record that song, and said, okay, fellas, that's it, we're done. And her father grabbed the mic in the studio and said, listen, sister, you have 8 minutes left, record that song. And that's how it happened.
Now, how many times did she do that?
She only did Who's Sorry Now once.
Unbelievable.
Well, a lot of songs were recorded like that. Rock Around the Clock was the same reason.
No kidding.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's funny how those last-minute songs that they squeezed into the sessions became huge, huge hits.
You know, talking about the people, though, who just really were just wealth, they were like treasure troves, was Bo Diddley. And you were down at the river when he
Yes, I
performed here in
was.
Poughkeepsie. I was. What an interesting story, Bo Diddley.
Oh.
And we're going to take a look at, we got his album cover up there with all those signatures. But let's listen to a little bit of Bo because he has his own story.
Yes, he does.
Jimmy Reed, Bo Diddley, Jeff Berry, Elvis Presley. I've seen them all. Yes, I have. I've been on the stage with all the greatest people like Fats Domino, the late great Ray Charles, oh baby, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Brother B.B. King, oh, Brother James Brown, whoa, I've seen them all. I've seen them all, yes I have.
You know, what a great album. And I mean, you just see the difference. I mean, Bo Diddley still performing. What is he, in his 80s when he did that show?
He was 76 years old.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, and I did the interview. That's the only interview for the 100 interviews that I did in Poughkeepsie, right here at home. And it was great. You know, he had his thing, too, about getting ripped off in the industry. You know, when you think of Bo Diddley, you have to put him in the class of a Jerry Lee Lewis and a
Right.
Chuck Berry.
Right.
He's kind of a notch ahead of a lot of these other groups and not quite as high as Elvis, but certainly in the echelon, the upper echelon.
Well known. Well known.
And this was a tragedy. He told me during the interview, he said, you know, Tony, I'm 76 years old. And don't get me wrong, I love performing for which we saw the night before.
Right.
And he said, I love playing my music, but if I don't play every weekend, I don't pay my electric bill next month. And I was stunned because he had so many hits.
Yeah.
Well, here's the story he told me. His real name, his stage name is Bo Diddley.
Right.
His real name is Elias McDaniel. And what happened was he would look at the records when they came out and they would say, Who Do You Love, the title of the song, recorded by Bo Diddley,
Right.
written by E. McDaniel. And he said he just would go out there and perform, and you know, he was living great and loving what he was
And
doing.
he's, of course, you've seen that on the records.
Sure, he looked at it right on the record label. So he
Right.
figured, well, I'm getting covered as the artist, Bo Diddley, and I'm covered as the writer, E. McDaniel, as Elias McDaniel.
Right.
Unfortunately, 25 years later, he changed managers, and the manager informed him that he was kind of broke. He didn't have much money. So they investigated, and they found out there was a very wealthy guy working at Chess Records named Edward McDaniel.
And guess where the money was going?
To Edward McDaniel.
But didn't he take this to court, though?
He did take it to court. He spent $15,000 to $20,000 of his own money fighting this court because, you know, it's kind of hard fighting the corporate structure of the recording industry.
Right.
And they kept stalling it off. And finally, the ruling came out from the judge that there was a statute of limitations and there was nothing they could do about it.
After all of those years, after all of those hits, and still performing in the 70s just to
pay the bills.
Pay the bills.
Yeah.
You know, you hear these unfortunate stories, and then you hear about the chiffons. I mean, what happened with the chiffons?
You know, the Chiffons was a very funny story. I interviewed Judy Craig Mann, who's the lead singer of the Chiffons. She's still performing today. And I had interviewed her in New Haven, Connecticut at backstage at one of her shows. And after the show, I would typically sit on a folding chair and watch the show from what they call the wings, from the side.
Right.
And this promoter said, no, I have great seat reserved for you out front, my guest. So I went out and sat out front, but I could look in the wings and see the next act that was coming on.
Right.
And a very well-known disc jockey, whose name will not go mentioned, had some index cards in his hands to introduce each group.
Right.
And I saw Judy and the girls getting ready to come on the stage, and the disc jockey said, you're in for a real treat now. Here's one of the most popular girl groups from the 60s, and they had He's So Fine and all these great hits. And they also have the distinction of opening for the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
Wow.
Well, Judy had just told me backstage she never even met the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. It was one of those stories. She said, I don't know how it got out there, but everybody wants to know what Paul McCartney was like. We never even met them.
But you know, the Motown sound, boy, I mean, to this day, what a huge dynamo that was in terms of, I think it really began to bring a lot of minority artists up in terms of the visibility.
Oh, no doubt about it.
Very important.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
And,
I mean, I interviewed Mary Wilson of the Supremes.
Oh, that's right.
I actually interviewed her in a 50s vintage ice cream parlor in North Wildwood, New Jersey. And it's funny because the owner was so happy to have Mary Wilson there that all during my tape, you can hear on the tape, we're just chewing on ice creams and he couldn't bring her enough things.
Well, we can't leave this without talking about Bill Haley and the Comets.
Well, they are the fathers of rock. I would say Rock Around the Clock is probably the first rock and roll hit.
It really was.
It almost didn't get recorded, though. They were coming across the river on a ferry, and the river got caught on the ferry got stuck on a sand barge.
Oh, my gosh.
And they were so delayed, they had a 3-hour recording session planned, and you can't get in there late because the next group is coming in. So they had a very fast session, and then with about 10 minutes left in the session, the engineer, and this is what they thought about rock and roll in those days, they said, okay, Mr. Haley, why don't you do that little rock and roll song of yours? And they put it together and rehearsed it and did it in a take and a half, Rock Around the Clock.
No kidding.
And it became the iconic tune of the generation.
It really did. In fact, I remember going to the movie, and I can't remember the movie, but I can remember
Rock Around the Clock.
That's what the name of the movie.
That was the name of the movie.
And we sat through this awful movie, but waiting to see Bill Haley and the Comets. And you know, it was, here I am in a little theater in Missouri, but you know, nationwide you had teenagers going they had to see Bill Haley and
Haley and the Comets. Do you know, to this day, when I interviewed Bill Haley's original Comets,
right,
the youngest one was 76, the oldest was 83, and they're still performing in Branson, Missouri right now.
Oh my gosh.
At the Dick Clark Theater.
Well, that's where my sister lives, so I'm going to tell her to go down and
Well, there you go. They're a great act, too. They're a great act.
You know, I truly love these books. Setting the Record Straight, 2 volumes. And the last one that you did, I'm sure you're heading on to doing yet another book.
I'm heading on to actually 2 books right now. One is a music book. It'll be volume 3, which focuses on the British invasion groups. And then I'm doing a more local book on hidden treasures here in the Hudson Valley that I've been working on for a while now.
Now, if I want to get this book, where do I get it, Anthony? Well,
they're going to be putting it on a screen. You can go to MySpace, Musso Books, to get the information off my page there on MySpace. Or you can email me direct, and they're flashing down on the screen, I'm sure, and I'll be glad to send you the flyers and the ordering information.
You are doing library talks, too, aren't you?
All the time. I'm always doing library talks. So, you know, the Poughkeepsie Journal, being the home newspaper in Dutchess, puts in a lot of the appearances at the libraries in their Sunday section.
You know something, folks, if you are looking for a holiday gift, or even if you just want to do it for your own pleasure, this is such a great set of books. And Tony, what great stuff to talk about. It makes me feel like a teenager again.
It was a labor of love for me to do. I went to those sock hops, and I told so many of those artists, you have no idea, I was 13 years old, falling in love to music in the Friday night dance.
Well, do the dance again. I'm Nancy Cozean. Thanks for joining us on Hudson Valley Views. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. I'm telling you, baby, making no mistake, I can make your body shake like a California earthquake. Oh, man. I said, man, I'm a hell of a man. Back down to beef can stew. Gonna bring back the second cousin, Little John the Conqueror. I'm a man. I say